Why are we constantly reminded that we must speak English? As English is the most popular language spoken around the world, and this is made possible because of colonization. Historically, Britain was able to colonize most part of the world, thereby making it a compulsory language to learn. And I use the word compulsory because of the colonization that took place, whereby the indigenous people of the countries of the world had no choice but to learn this language in order to communicate with the British, thereby making English a compulsory language for those countries that were colonized by Britain. So this is where it all began. This is the history. This is the root source of the popularity of the English language due to colonization around the world, not just in Africa. As colonization extended to Asia, North America, South America, and beyond. So English is very popular, which makes it really weird looking at it from this era. In that era, it appeared as one of the most important languages to speak. As to be able to partake in most business transactions in this era involve communicating in English. So English is widely spoken around the world. It has become an essential language to learn and to speak. And I feel sorry somehow for the English, those who own the language originally. I mean, how does it really feel when you're speaking your language and most of the time 100% of the people around you can definitely understand what you're saying? Doesn't it really feel that your conversation is somehow being infringed on? As in, everyone can understand what you're saying except if you have to whisper to yourself. So in that regard, I really do feel for those whose mother tongue is in English. Probably the English speaking has to learn another language and your communication not to be infringed on. That's a joke, by the way, because most languages these days are understood by others. Not one person speaks a language that is not understood by others. So as English has become so popular, most educational system is taught in English in most countries. When it comes to commercialization, most communication is spoken in English. Even communication by writing is done in English. So there's this pressure mounted in most other countries whereby they are torn between keeping their mother tongue, their original language, and as well speaking the English language. So when children are born, the parents now have to make the decision on what language to introduce to those children. If the parents are speaking in English and they also have their mother tongue, these parents are torn between what language to speak to their children and which one to withhold. Or is it that the children have to learn all the languages, which will be beneficial for the children? Because when children tend to speak 2 or more languages, according to studies, it helps the brain power, it helps them to be able to communicate in other people's languages, which is important for interrelation with other people, hence promoting social relationship with other cultures. And it also gives academic advantage to those children, as language is significant to one's identity and our origin. So since English has become so popular, if that individual happened to come from another country where English is not the first language and is not really fluent in the English language, then you find that individual struggling to articulate his or herself clearly in the English language. In few cases, when it comes to discrimination based on racial discrimination, you find that that individual is constantly told or reminded to speak English, as though not being able to speak English makes that individual non-intelligent or stupid. The English language is not a criteria to determine the intellectual capability of an individual. The English language is just a language, a medium of communication, just like every other language in every other world. And to tell you what, every other language is equally important, especially to one's identity. So if one is constantly reminded or asked to speak in English, especially when that person is struggling to articulate his or herself in that language, is that not a form of belittling the other person's competence, as though if that person cannot express his or herself in the English language, then the intellectual contribution of that person is insignificant? An individual's intelligence can be well articulated in the language that they are able to easily express or communicate themselves in. And one cannot be told all the time, especially forcefully or rudely, to speak English, whether they live in an English-speaking country or in a country that has embraced the English language, like for example in Africa. If we as individuals have to communicate with one another, I've got to respect the language you're expressing yourself in and show some form of interest in you by learning your language, and as well in return you learning my language, either by way of translation or by way of interrelationship in terms of learning one another's language, which shows that the relationship is not just one way, it's both ways, as it is known that pre-colonization in the African continent, different languages were spoken. In a country such as Nigeria alone, there are round about 250 languages, different languages that are spoken. And guess what? Currently, in that country, most of the people living there learn one another's language. So you see, somebody who is originally from the Yoruba tribe is able to speak the language of another tribe. For example, the Hausa language, the Igbo language, the Efik language, the Ora language, the Calabar language, and so many other languages. About 250 languages just in that country alone, let alone the entire continent of Africa. There are so many languages there. And the way it is in Africa is that these languages are spoken even by people who are not from that location, which is a way of promoting interrelationship. So one language is not dominating the other, but the English language has become one common language in that entire continent. As the English language has been promoted for so long and for so much, the indigenous language should also be promoted, as this will help in the educational system of the African child, as the mother tongue or the ethnic language is mostly spoken in the African countries. So if the mother tongue is mostly spoken in the African continent, why is this not a mode of communication, a mode of teaching in the institutions? because this way the struggle to understand the lecture in classes will be minimized. When this is minimized, then there will be progress, high progress for that matter, as the English language in such countries, in that continent, can be made an optional language whereby when it comes to emigrating for educational or career purposes, then one has the option of the English language. Just like it's done in countries like France. In France, English is not the predominant language spoken. French is the predominant language spoken. In addition, the citizens are given the option of learning other languages in order to be able to interrelate with the rest of the world. Asking people to speak English all the time, not allowing them to express themselves as well in public in their ethnic language, is like asking them to denounce their originality, to denounce their identity, to change themselves for you to be pleased with them. And I'm sure even when they do that, they still will be reminded that they are not English, regardless. Because I've seen an incident in a train whereby a couple was speaking in their ethnic language, and this other English person became uncomfortable, started shouting at the couple to speak in English. But in actual fact, the couples were just communicating with themselves privately. How is it a criteria to speak English in a public place? I mean, if one has to speak in English for businesses, in an educational institution, or in a place whereby you have to communicate with other people in English, then one has to speak in English. But if one is communicating with another person who does not understand English or chose not to communicate in English but another language with a person who understands that other language, what is the problem in speaking in other languages aside speaking in English? English is one of the languages in the world. Every other person should have the freedom to be able to communicate in other languages that they choose to communicate in, and should not be burdened or forced to speak in English when they have chosen not to speak in English, or when it's not required to speak in English at all for business purposes or educational purposes, because that's their identity. That's who they are. That's where they are originally from. And the other languages cannot be discarded because it's their identity. It's their culture. As other people around the world have embraced the English language, the English also have to learn to embrace others. All right? With this, I say thank you very much for watching and listening. See you in the next video. Take care now. Bye.
Is speaking Spanish to customers when they should be speaking English.
A shocking tirade right in the middle of a Manhattan restaurant.
Every person I listen to, he's spoken, she's speaking it, is American.
An enraged man threatening to call immigration authorities on employees who were speaking Spanish.
I pay for their welfare, I pay for their ability to be here. The least they can do is speak
welfare? Video of the encounter Tuesday quickly went viral after Edward Suazo posted it on his Facebook page, writing that his wife and her best friend were talking to one of the restaurant employees in Spanish when the man overheard them.
Honey, I'm going ice.
Outraged internet sleuths shared the video asking for help identifying the man. This video is just the latest example of seemingly bigoted or biased behavior going viral.
To the lawyer's tirade about people speaking Spanish, the mayor of New York City tweeted, "The city's diversity is our strength, and the people who call this city home speak more than 200 languages, and they are all welcome here." Apparently, the man threw his drink and sandwich down and said he didn't want the restaurant to have his money. When he left, people in the restaurant applauded.
And ironically, on his bio, he speaks Spanish fluently.
Spanish and wants to try to get people in by saying, hey, yeah, I speak Spanish.